Hi Pramila, can you hear me?
Yes. Do you see me?
Yes, sure.
I
Okay.
cannot see myself. Okay.
Okay, and we are live. So,
Okay.
hello everyone. I'm Sourabhi Dutta Roy, your project lead for the Story Project 12 by www.tellmeastory.biz, and I welcome you all to the sixth episode of the Women Without Names series. I feel extremely privileged to have with us today Professor Sushmita Das, Ms. Anjali Enjeti, and Dr. Pramila Venkateswaran. Today's topic for the discussion is going to be on refugee narratives. Tell Me a Story calls for submissions on the story prompt, that is, Women Without Names. Registrations are also open for our writing program season 13. So, without further ado, let me begin now by introducing our panelists for the audience. Sushmita Das is currently the head of the Department of English and IQAC coordinator of Rani Billa Girls College, affiliated to the Calcutta University. She has participated in several seminars and workshops conducted by the University of Calcutta and Jadavpur University, presented papers at seminars conducted by English Study Centre and Medinipur College invited lecture, and has acted as chairperson for a seminar conducted by Howrah Dinabandhu Andrews College. She has also participated in the guest lecture series Master's Program at Maulana Azad College. Welcome, Professor Das. Moving on, our next panelist, Anjali Enjeti, is a former attorney and author of two award winning books, Southbound Essays on Identity, Inheritance and Social Change, and The Parted Earth. Her articles have appeared in the Los Angeles Times, Boston Globe, Harper's Bazaar, and elsewhere. She is co-founder of the Georgian chapter of They See Blue, an organization for South Asian Democrats, and was a member of the Georgia Asian American and Pacific Islander Leadership Council for the 2020 Biden-Harris campaign. Welcome, Anjali. Our last panelist for the day, Pramila Venkateswaran, is the Poet Laureate of Suffolk County, Long Island, and co-director of Mathwala South Asian Diaspora Poetry Festival. She is the author of most recently The Singer of Alipi, an award-winning poet. She also teaches English and Women's Studies at Nassau Community College, New York. Welcome, Pramila. Right. So, to begin with, I would like you to share a true story of a refugee woman that left a mark on you, and how has this story influenced you as a thinker or in your own identity formation or understanding of history as a whole? Um, Professor Das, would you like to begin?
Yes. Good evening to all. And at the very outset, I would like to thank Tell Me Your Story and Shorobi for inviting me as a panelist for this discussion. Well, I admit that penning down thoughts, writing stories is really not my forte, but I've been waiting for years and ages for a platform where I could share uh, the refugee narratives that I have grown up with, that I've lived through with family members who did narrate these stories right from a young age, till the age I got married. Now, you must be wondering that are these stories and narratives figments of fiction? If not, then how do I have so many stories in my kitty? Well, I was born to parents who and whose families they belong to Bangladesh, now Bangladesh, then popularly known as East Bengal. And I was married into a family who also were victims of the partition and post partition crisis. So these narratives have been with me for a long, long time. These narratives talk about how my family members and my in laws, how they were displaced, forcibly displaced, and they were forced to leave their homeland. Okay? And they had to reconstruct their lives in a new, quote unquote, foreign land. In this context, it is Calcutta. It was unknown to them. Now, the common link between the two families is that they were branded as refugees. Okay? That is what. And today, I would like to share the messy ordeal. I'm quoting Sourabhi, the messy ordeal and the struggle that a refugee woman went through during this. And she's my mother in law, late Aruti Dash. Okay. And please pardon me, I get too emotional when I'm narrating her story. So I've just jotted down the key features of her journey, and I'll be referring to them on and often just to, sort of make it a bit dispassionate. Otherwise, tears are going to roll down my eyes. Okay, such was the ordeal. Now, I'll take you all back in time to the month of October, November, year 1947, place Dhaka, Bikrampur, which is now part of Munshiganj district in Bangladesh. Aruti, having lost her parents at a very young age, had once before migrated to Calcutta at the age of 6 years. And she migrated from Dhaka, Bikrampur, and her village was Hashara village. She was under the guardianship of her uncle, who admitted her to Beltola Girls High School. A very bright student, Aruti diligently pursued her education till she reached the age of 15, and she was in class 9. Her uncle, not too keen to spend much on her upkeep, soon got her married off to a strapping young man, 22 years of age, who too hailed from Dhaka, Bikrampur, and who had just completed his graduation and was working in a very insignificant private firm in Calcutta. Having no choice, Aruti, that is my mother in law, had to give up her school, get married to this youth who is Bimal in the year 1947. This is in September 1947. She then migrated back to her homeland, Bikrampur, but this time to a different village, the village of her husband, that is Shologhar. And she comforted herself with the idea that at least now she would have a home, quote unquote, her very own home, be it her husband's home, but it is her home, if not a school. Now, the 15-year-old child bride was oblivious of the communal riots that had already started in East Bengal and was gradually spreading like wildfire. Bimal left her behind in his ancestral home under the care of his mother, younger sisters, and a brother. Bimal's father was in the forest service based in Jalpaiguri district, North Bengal, that is. So at Bikrampur, at the ancestral house, it was a woman's world. There were only women around with a little brother out there. Now, within a few days, Bimal returned to Calcutta, and on his return, he found that he had lost his job. At the same time, he received news that his ancestral uh, area, that is Shologhar, that too now was under the siege of the riots. And news also came in that his young wife, his mother, younger sisters, they were feeling insecure. And the reason for the insecurity, all the royal retainers of their house, they belong to the quote unquote other community, who were gradually being brainwashed towards persecution. So Bimal had to go back, and he had to take an overnight decision of moving and crossing over the newly constructed international border along with the rest of the family. Now, this journey was really a difficult one. And the village, Shologhar, it has many canals. So they had to go for boat ride, they had to travel in vehicles, they had to squeeze themselves in to overloaded trains. And before that, on advice of my mother in law, Aruti, what my father in law did, he was also very young. but all the property papers, the legal documents, his wife advised him that I will put a plaster around your leg and you put the documents inside so that when things are normal, we can come back and we have the papers with us. We don't lose anything. So, with that hope, though crestfallen that they had to leave their property, just leave it and run away, so as to say, flee from that place. They landed in Shialda station. Okay, it's still called Shialda now. And Shialda station then was another refugee camp. And by the time they came here, Bimal and Aruti and their family members, they were branded, quote unquote, partition refugees. They were homeless. They were destitutes and they had no place to put up. Even Arati's uncle did not quite welcome these family members. They found it tough themselves to make ends meet, so they were welcomed in his house. So, by just a stroke of luck, my father in law met one of his acquaintances from his own village who arranged for a shelter. Now, what kind of a shelter? 7 family members squeezed themselves in to a single room apartment. It's not an apartment, a single room in Kalighat area, now at Horish Chatterjee Street, where they had a small space for the cooking, which in a common courtyard, and they had to share a community bathroom and toilet. So the ordeal had just begun. And in the process of all this, the ordeal of the child bride, Aruti, doubles when she realizes that she is expecting her first child. Okay. And at this time, they had lost contact with my father-in-law's father, who was then the only bread earner. So there was a financial crisis, which they tried to find ways to tide over. And to do this, Bimal, who was now without a job, he offered tuitions. Aruti too offered tuitions or expressed a desire to offer tuitions to augment the family income. But where would she find her students? The children around, they were the children of displaced parents, so they had no money to offer. Maybe a single meal, which they at times could offer. That was the fee that they could pay. Uh, Again, by stroke of luck, my mother-in-law got to offer tuition to one of the children of a businessman who was staying in Shobha Bajar. Now, where they were staying in Kalighat, and the house in Shobha Bajar is about 15 kilometers. Okay? So by this time, she had given birth to her first daughter, and having her mother-in-law supporting her throughout, who took care of the 1-month-old daughter, Aruti used to travel every day for 15 kilometers by tram and foot to Shobha Bajar to coach the little boy for a meager and paltry sum of rupees 5. Unthinkable, rupees 5. And the tiffin that she was served, she used to carry it back home to share with her family. And she was always a bright student. And once again, she felt the desire to resume her schooling. So she contacted Beltola Girls High School, but they refused to admit her on the grounds that she's a married woman and she would be, quote unquote, a bad influence on the young unmarried girls with all her stories of marital life and all. But it was her principal, and she has remained always grateful to her principal, who saw the spark in Aruti. And she took back Aruti to her school and readmitted her to her school. So the tuition that she offered for a meager paltry sum of rupees 5. That sort of paid for her school fees as well as her examination fees. And then it was the other members of the family, they realized that it was Aruti who had the ability in her to stand on her own feet. She had the determination, the grit to contribute to the upliftment of her family, be it the financial side or whichever side. Aruti's sister-in-laws, okay, they were growing up, and her brother-in-law, they also tried to contribute so as that the financial crisis is reduced a bit by running odd errands, by selling fish that they caught from nearby canals and ponds. They didn't mind doing it. They didn't feel any shame because they had to sustain themselves. And in between, Aruti motivated these little uh, sister-in-laws and brother-in-law to resume their schooling, and she became their private tutor. She coached them whenever she had time. By this time, Dr. B.C. Roy, the then Chief Minister of West Bengal, he offered these refugees arid lands surrounding Calcutta. My father-in-law Bimal got such an allotment at Pollisri, an area adjoining now Golf Green. No, these areas were they were brinjal fields, okay, with a lot of water bodies here and there. Land filling started, and the squatters' colonies developed. The famous squatters' colonies, they developed. Aruti by this time had completed her intermediate examination, and her family now shifted to a makeshift hut, you could say, made out of elephant grass. It had a thatched roof, and the seven of them shifted to Pollisri. And I'm speaking from that very area right now. Okay, uh, the houses remain. Yes, it has changed the nature of the house, but the area is the same. It's Pollisri that I'm speaking from. Now, Bimal by this time got a job as as a clerk in Life Insurance Corporation of India. And one interesting point about these squatters' colonies was that, you know, they all bonded together to set up schools and colleges. So by the time Aruti gave birth to her second daughter, but this did not really deter her from stopping going to college or school or pursuing with her education. So she sought permission from her mother-in-law, and she joined Bijoygawar College as one of its first batch of students. And it was quite near to her house, and it was a day college. So she would complete her household chores, her designated household chores as a daughter-in-law, and then leave for college nearby. Who was a tutor? Her tutor was my father-in-law, her husband, Bimal, who would religiously coach her late at night after all Arati's household duties were over. He used to read her texts, etc., and explain to her. So he became her private tutor. On the other hand, Aruti, once she uh, got herself admitted to college, she admitted her sister-in-laws and her brother-in-law to nearby schools, and once again she continued tutoring them in her spare time. Having completed her graduation in Bengali as a special subject, Aruti managed to secure a job at a nearby school that had been established for girls, Gandhi Colony Girls High School. But then she needed to improve her scale of pay. Okay, for that, she needed to do her master's. And then once again, she got the support of her mother-in-law and family members and her husband, and she joined Jadavpur University evening section to do her master's program in Bangla. So her everyday routine was such that in the morning she got early in the morning, completed her household chores, went to teach in a school, walking, it was nearby, and then from her school, she would go directly to Jadavpur University, 2.5 kilometers. She would walk it all the way. She had to save money by not getting onto a bus, the only means available then to Jadavpur University. And well, she successfully completed her master's classes, and a Wonder Woman like her, she completed her B.Ed with two daughters and her family beside her. Her father-in-law, in the meantime, came back from Paiguri. He was a retired person right now with little savings. So Arati had to think of some other means of supplementary, supplementing the financial bit of their family. So what she did was she started stitching clothes, not just for family, but for other people in the neighborhood. And this way she could earn a bit and she could save a bit by stitching clothes for her own children and her other family members. Her embroidery skills, her knitting skills by this time attracted the neighborhood ladies and girls. And during school holidays, when she started offering classes to these ladies, initially free of cost, but later for a minimum fee. She joined the Usha School of Tailoring and acquired a diploma. Even after I got married, I found that ladies used to come in to seek guidance. Okay, but this time she didn't charge anything. The only thing she charged was their love for her. No money, no money involved. Soon after, my husband, that is Aruti's son, was born. The struggle, though it continued, but now they had their feet firmly grounded in a quote unquote new land, which they were forced to call their home. But they never ever lost the hope of going back and reclaiming their actual home. Now, dismissing threats of discrimination, elimination, her daughters and son grew up to be responsible citizens of the country. Daughters, both their daughters, their mother was the architect of their careers too. They are postgraduates in English. They have retired as teachers of government schools. Her son is a postgraduate mechanical engineer who's an established from Jadavpur University and now an established businessman in the field of manufacturing. And whatever they are, whatever Arati's sister-in-laws are now, some of them are working in hospitals as nurses, some of them are working as engineers. It's all because of Arati. She did what she did not just for herself but for her family. And yes, she breathed her last on 5th May 2006, but she's still alive. She's alive in her students. She's alive as Bordimuni or elder sister. That's what they referred to her in Bangla. She's alive in her children. She's alive in me because it is she who has been the key influence in me becoming a professor, in me taking up teaching as a profession. Now, I would just like to take you back to my parents, whom I referred. They too were refugees, but they were amongst the very, very select few who were affluent and privileged refugees for whom reconstructing their lives in Calcutta was not as uh, arduous and difficult like that of my uh, family, that is Aruti's family, and my in-laws' family. So I grew up in a very comfortable zone. Yes, the trauma of partition, that is, the psychological trauma was there in my parents, okay? But we grew up in a very comfortable zone where we were groomed in a manner where we were taught that after marriage, home is a world for woman. not the world outside. But when I met Aruti as my mother-in-law, and when I heard her stories of struggle, she used to sit with me, narrate to me the stories in an effort to sort of create that bond, because ours was an arranged marriage and they were very new to me. And it was these narratives which set that bond between us. And her struggle made a statement in my life. And it was she who told me for the first time that, yes, you are so educated, pursue it till however much you want to, but you must make a mark in society. You must be financially independent. You must utilize your ability to prove yourself that you are the man of the world too. Home and the world is where women can rule as much as the man rules in the world. So, she helped me sort of erase that preset divide between home and woman and man and the world. And it was she who insisted that I continue with my MPhil in spite of me expecting my son. She supported me throughout. It was she who inspired me to appear for an interview. I got the job as a professor in Ranibilla, as lecturer, then it was lecturer, as in Ranibilla Girls College. And I still remember her words which ring in my ears. She said that I'm retired now. So now the home is where I stay. It belongs to me now. You go out into the world, prove yourself that you can do what any man can do. I think, I'm narrating this, I'm having goosebumps all over. Like, I can never forget the contribution that she has made. So I think many of you will be wondering that I've chosen my mother-in-law, not my mother. Yes, all mothers influence their children, okay? But my mother-in-law had a different kind of influence on me, which has like placed me in the position that I am in. And like her, what she wanted me to be the architect of many, many girls, okay, in shaping their career, in shaping their mindset, in shaping their beliefs, that we women, we are not anonymous. Our actions are our identity. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for being so candid with us. Uh, Especially, and I can vouch for it if I can, if I can just take a moment, because you have been my professor. So, um, thank you, ma'am. Moving on to Anjali, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sourabhi, and thank you to tell me your story. It's wonderful to be back here and to be a part of this conversation. And thank you, Sushmita, for introducing us to your mother-in-law, who sounds like an absolutely extraordinary woman. So I want to just first give a little sense of my positionality when it comes to refugee narratives about women. I am not a current or former refugee, and I am not the descendant of refugees. However, as a journalist and an activist, I have reported on refugees and immigration, and I have worked as an activist among refugees in the state of Georgia, where I live. I think I'll start out by answering the second question first, which is, how do refugees influence your understanding of history? One of the biggest misunderstandings, I think, in the United States, but I also think in other countries, is that refugees are a problem of people. And that's not true. They are a problem of borders. It is a political issue. We tend to cast and support narratives that a refugee is somehow at fault, or has the burden of sort of proving their worth in their adoptive country, which is just false. I think we tend to believe that refugees need to contribute to a capitalistic structure in order to have value, in order to have humanity. And this is what I have been exploring and understanding as I've looked into this issue. It is a problem of borders. It is a problem of the wars and the genocides and the colonization that create these very fictional lines in the sand. I'm not just speaking of the Indian subcontinent here. I'm talking about what makes refugees all over the world. As many of you know, the U.S.-Mexico border has been the site of many people seeking to build lives in the United States because their lives are not sustainable in either Mexico or particularly Central America. And so what they are fleeing is persecution from violence. They are fleeing climate change. They are fleeing economic unsustainability, simply not being able to make a living, to feed their families, and to put a roof over their head. And what happens in the mainstream media in the United States is it creates a narrative of sort of the ideal refugee who pulled themselves up with their bootstraps. And if you can prove your worth in this country, you deserve to live here. And so what I argue in my reporting is that everybody deserves to have a safe place, deserves to have food and shelter and health, and to raise their families in an environment that allows them to thrive. So now I will talk specifically about two people in my life who are former refugees, who are colleagues, and who I work with, and whose work I admire. One is an Afghan-American journalist named Fariba Nawa. We talk every single day. She came from Afghanistan in the 1980s, grew up in the Bay Area, but now makes her home with her family in Istanbul. And she reports on authoritarian regimes. She has written for many, nationally, internationally known publications. And her current focus right now is on Iran, the Iranian regime, and the women-led Iranian revolution that is happening right now, and how the women are organizing and resisting the regime, and trying to make it something of what it was in the past, which is women having more rights and in a more secular nation. She has a podcast called On Spec, where she writes her own stories with a team of writers that criticize these authoritarian regimes. And another woman who I work very closely with in Georgia, her name is Cam Ashling. She is a former Vietnamese refugee who came to the United States also in the 1980s. And she has been a very large part of the resistance movement here against fascism, which is really weaving itself quite steadily in US politics. She became active here in getting out the vote in Asian American communities after Donald Trump was elected in 2016. And she has worked to mobilize and build coalitions within the greater Asian American community, which includes, of course, South Asians, to make sure that people have a voice in their governments, that they are counted, that they vote, that they are informed and educated about candidates. So those are two women in particular who have really changed my understanding of what it means to build a life in another country and to be a part of that community. And like I said, while I do certainly admire them and the work they do, and I have learned so much from them, I still maintain that we have to be careful with these narratives of success when it comes to refugees, because everybody, whether it's the famous journalist or activist or someone else who thrives in whatever career they do, Everyone deserves to have a place, and deserves to thrive as human beings where they live. And we want to make sure that we allow space for everyone and not just um, refugees, former refugees, asylum seekers, who we want to say they have to contribute to society. Let's give people homes, and let's let them live their lives in places that they deserve to live in. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anjali, for sharing that. Moving on to Pramila, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sourabhi, for inviting me to this session. And thank you, TMYS. It has been wonderful for me to be in this panel and listen to the story that Sushmita just narrated and what Anjali had to say about the different shades of meaning behind the word refugee. So I want to introduce my stance here. I'm not a refugee, but I am a professor teaching in New York. I'm also a poet, and I'm an activist. Um, so as a person living in New York and having students who come to a community college, because I teach in a community college that serves like much of the community in the area which is between Queens, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Bronx. So, which means that we get a lot of students from all of these areas. I have a lot of students who are basically orphans or refugees or new immigrants. So, we have a variety of these students. So, my first experience of teaching in this college many years ago, this student in my class, so I have many stories to tell, but I'm just going to tell you one. Um, that she had escaped an abusive marriage, and she had left her 3 children under the care of a friend and had come to New York, stayed with a relative, and she was trying to catch up on courses to get into the nursing program, and which is a very arduous program. She did get into the nursing program. So during that time, she had taken my class, and so I got to know a lot of her story. And what struck me was the kind of courage and the tenacity that she had. And it brought me in very close touch with what a woman goes through in leaving an abusive marriage and coming to a totally strange country, even though she had a relative, and the relative kicked her out. And she was couch surfing. She was couch surfing and somehow getting to class on time, handing in her papers, and her entire goal was to get the job after the nursing program, get the kids over to New York somehow. And some of us helped her. We gave her money to get a lawyer and all of those things. But besides that, it is the emotional uh, difficulty and the resilience, and of course sometimes it was not the resilience, it was the utter loneliness that I was witness to. So I want to draw your attention to how important it is to be a witness. And my poetry is witness writing. So I wrote a book called Behind Dark Waters, where I narrated the stories of many of the women around me. And I captured this particular student's story in this poem. It's called Someday I'll Write My Story. I'll write, I married, had kids, cooked, dressed up to bargain at the fish market on Sundays, quarreled with my mother in law, attended mass, never looked at men because they had sex in their eyes. I told him, one day I'm tired of carrying your weight. I burned for books. I'll write about the night when my body shook like leaves in a storm. My arms clamped around me to make it stop. My tongue sputtered, Our Father, till I went mad and grew still only when light crept in. There's so much to tell. I don't know where to begin. From my birth, when my fate was written with a bad hand, how to explain the weird bends or when I plunged my hands into life, submerging old routes. I'll write about walking Maria to the clinic, travel papers tucked under my slip, crisp, the stamp on them like a stain. How a woman stepped out of me, flew to New York, sipping ginger ale, her home a green dot on the Caribbean. How she dropped her ring into a manhole on Lexington by the zebra crossing. So I feel a poem is able to capture the kind of emotion and the kind of, uh, you know, telling of a narrative, because there's so much when you talk about a narrative. Things emerge, things get submerged, a narrative keeps changing, but there is truth in every story that one says, even though some facts may change. Certain things come to light, certain things are in shadow. I would also like to argue that even though we think of refugee as a border that is drawn and people are made into refugees, I also want to argue that even in a home, a woman can become a refugee on account of violence. And so my book, The Singer of Alleppey, which is about my paternal grandmother, is a tribute to her and also a reconstruction of her life and how she dealt with being married to a violent man, and how she was able to negotiate her way within that violence. So I want to share with you one poem that brings out the emotion of a woman who's a refugee in her home and she cannot find security within her house. The long shadow of evil. The hall spins, bride, groom, flowers, guests, husband. Then routine happens. Do I have all the ingredients for the feast? A bird bangs itself against glass and falls. That's how I feel when he slaps my face. Spirit, better not stand me up, I yell silently. This is how surprise springs and settles. Wordless bitterness in my throat. His causeless rage twisting him ugly. I know the difference between sinking dark and womb dark. My marriage is dung. I choke. Marriage is dung, dung, dung. Singers croon Sita Kalyanam Vaibhogame, Rama Kalyanam Vaibhogame. As bride and groom walk around the fire, roses on the nuptial bed, stitched into garlands, roses perfuming waters, anointing the wedded pair. I place my hands on my truth telling heart. Thud, 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 thud. I close my eyes. The hall spins. His rage, my humiliation. Then the pretense, laughter, and gossip. The rippling of ever after. Symbols of fertility mocking me. Twin hills of lentils. Clay pots filled with new sprouts. Babies placed on the bride's silken lap. The circle of fire redrawing her womb. My husband's father and his father's father, their anger, a fiery chain will dog my sons. How will they pick their paths through evil sown by ghosts? My dead mother calls, Sitala, tune up the strings before your mind dulls and bells drag you to duties. His words, I'll die and only then you'll regret. I tune out. Mother visits in dreams. Sing your heart out. You're wedded to words till your tongue is ash. Thank you. So, in conclusion, I would say, responding to your very first question, is that as a writer, I bring out stories to the attention of a wider audience. And then, working as a teacher, I try to listen more carefully to what my students have to say. And also, as working as part of, as part of the biggest feminist organization, National Organization for Women. I try to help with endorsing leaders in local and federal elections who will advocate for refugee and women's rights.
Thank you, Pramila, especially for sharing both the poems. They were absolutely wonderful, literally gave goosebumps. Moving on to my next question to Anjali. For the current generation of youth, the partition of India might just be a historical moment. It is of course not a lived experience for them. Neither did they engage with any first-hand narrative or experiences. So hence they are in a way far too detached from the reality that comes with it. So while writing your novel The Parted Earth, how did you frame your narrative in a way that it affected the present generation just as much? And it would be wonderful if you could share a little something from your book.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Pramila, for that beautiful reading. It was absolutely breathtaking. So I think I can answer your question, Sourabhi, by first saying how the book came about. I had been researching partition for no particular reason other than I was interested in it for about a decade. I had no thought of writing a book about it. What happened was twofold. One is I discovered the existence of the 1947 Partition Archive, which has been collecting thousands of stories of partition survivors and their descendants since 2010. And until then, there were certainly people in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh who were collecting stories. Many of them were academics at universities, but they were smaller projects. So the Partition Archive was the first nonprofit archive to collect a wide range of stories from all over the subcontinent, and the sheer volume of stories that they collected. And discovering that archive and reading on their social media pages excerpts from the testimonies that they were receiving survivors made me think about the fact that if you think of the time, right, from 1947 to 2010, it made me think about how many survivors of partition were not alive and passed away before the archive was created. And in thinking about the archive, I also began thinking about my dear friends who were descendants from partition, whose family members were so traumatized actually from partition that they were actually never able to find out what exactly happened to their loved ones. And so it made me think about the fact that there were millions, likely millions, of lost survivors' stories of partition. So it was then that I began to imagine a grandmother and a granddaughter who are estranged in part due to the trauma and the tragic event that happened to the grandmother named Deepa, who was living in Delhi in 1947 as a 16-year-old girl, and how her descendant, her granddaughter, Shanti, who is living in 2017 as a 41-year-old woman, who has no ties whatsoever to her Indian heritage, and how this traces back to the traumas her grandmother experienced during partition. And so, what I am writing about in the book are the ripple effects of partition. Some of them are really positive, right? Sushmita has shared a beautiful example of her own family, and this family that was able to thrive despite living through this time period. But what I came to know through reading the testimonies of many survivors of partition is it doesn't always work out like that. That, in fact, living through partition leads to sort of an avalanche of other problems, many of which become insurmountable, many of which become families breaking apart and never hearing from their loved ones again. Many of them become loss of language, loss of culture, loss of food, loss of an understanding of how their ancestors were affected by this catastrophic time period in history. So what I'm going to read to you is a very brief scene early in the book. This excerpt comes from the point of view of Deepa, 16 years old. in the summer of 1947. Deepa is a schoolgirl, and she is a Hindu, and she is beginning to start falling in love with another Muslim schoolboy who lives in her area. And Deepa can see the tension and the strife and the calamity happening around her. But she's also kind of trying to stay in denial. She doesn't want to know what's going to happen to her friends and to her community members and to Amir. And Amir, who is also 16, is trying to get through to her to help her understand what's happening. And in this scene, they are at a market. Deepa sort of sneaks away to meet up with him, and Amir is with his 6-year-old younger sister named Layla. My father won't listen to anyone, Deepa said. He's determined to keep the clinic open. And you don't understand the forces I'm talking about, Amir said. Deepa huffed. I'm not some naive schoolgirl, Amir. I have eyes. I live here too. But you don't. Let's go, Amir, Layla whined, looping her fingers through Amir's belt. I want to go home. Layla, he snapped, please. Layla's mouth fell open. Her lower lip quivered. Deepa bent low and put her hand on Layla's shoulder and eyed Amir. Your brother did not mean to talk to you like that. He didn't mean to talk to me like that either. He's just worried. Please give us a little more time, Layla. I'm going to make sure he calms down. Then he'll be ready to leave with you. Layla nodded slowly and sulked to the corner. She draped herself over an upturned crate. I'm sorry, Deepa, Amir said. Amir, I can't imagine what you and your family are experiencing right now, she said. I want to help you. But if my parents decide to stay in Delhi, I can't change their minds. And I'm frightened already. I don't need you to frighten me anymore. I understand, he said. I'm sorry, Deepa. She stepped back. She searched the crowd of shoppers. She spotted Bala inspecting grains of rice, and her nose turned up. In her own hand, Bala held a paper bag. The parathas, soaked in oil, stained the bottom. Deepa had been born and raised in Delhi and knew this city, this India intimately. It wasn't so much that she didn't believe Amir. It was more that she couldn't understand how quickly things could change in such a short period of time. Or maybe things had always been changing. Maybe tensions had always been rising like the sea at high tide. People are inherently good, her mother had told her once. They're just not inherently good all of the time. Amir had been right to some degree. Deepa had been naive. She had been callous, even. She had bought into denial to push away her fear. India was on a verge of a war with itself. She could see this now. I have to go, Deepa said. Deepa, please make your father understand things are worse than he thinks, Amir said. Please, I'm worried about you. And I'm worried about you, she said. What will your family do? How will you escape this? My mother found some temporary seamstress work, and together we're saving for the train tickets. As soon as we've saved enough, he said, we're moving to Lahore. Lahore, less than 500 kilometers north to the north. And yet it might as well have been worlds away. Surely she would never see Amir again. She searched his face, those lips that had brushed against hers, for a different answer, and blinked away tears. She wanted him safe, and yet safety meant their separation. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Anjali, for giving the behind the scenes to your book. And of course, the excerpt was wonderful. Moving on to Professor Das, reversing the question I had just asked to Anjali, you are one of those who have heard the first person narrative, like you already said, of the messy, violent, traumatic history from your parents, which must have made it very personal for you, though it was not maybe a direct experience as such. So, at what age did you hear about them, and what were your initial emotions? And did the stories of cruelty and oppression ever, leave any kind of hatred for another community as such?
I want to thank Anjali as well as Pramila for those sensitive musings on refugees and partitions. It was really, really, it made me emotional once again. Anyway, coming back to Saurabhi's question, as I've mentioned earlier, I've been hearing these stories about the partition victims, the riots from a very young age. But, the impact that these stories have had on me uh, changed, with different phases in my life. So when I was a child, about 3 4 years old, my aunt used to regale us with these stories during bedtime. So then it was like, adventure stories. Okay, adventure stories. And well, we heard them, and it easier for her to put us to bed. But then, as I gradually matured, like I was a teenager, I read about the partition in school. I was in class 9 and 10. My reaction to it was a bit different, in the sense that the impact wasn't that much, but it was the first time that I felt that I was a descendant of a refugee, and the children of the host country, like during partition, it's India, the host country. Like the children, my schoolmates, they used to point fingers and say that, oh, you are the land grabbers. You were vagabonds. Your parents were vagabonds. They were non-scripts. Okay, they didn't have an identity. You don't have a place of your own. You have usurped our space. Okay, so the stories that I heard, I tried to find in them elements of heroism, valor, and chivalry to counter these aspersions that were made on us. But we were too young, and well, we didn't give it much thought. We were still friends out there. But the impact, I don't mind saying, I felt when I got married, and when I got to hear the ordeal, the trauma from my mother-in-law and the other members of my husband's family. Like, as I've already mentioned, again, I'm repeating, as I mentioned before, the trauma of partition for my parents, it was more psychological, but the impact so was not really that much as it was for my in-laws family. And like, questions had been coming up in my mind from when I was a teenager. But when I heard uh, the actual story, okay, from my mother-in-law, the narratives, they sort of prompted me to react in a way that, why us? Why have they made us lose everything? They, meaning the other, quote unquote, the other community. It's for them that you have to suffer so much. So why the question is why. But yes, definitely, I don't mind saying, yes, I did feel that tinge of hatred against them. Okay, but as I matured more, I got to read about partition as a professor. I got to teach partition literature, and I got to know about the other side of the story too. And that it's not just that those who crossed over to India, that they were victims. The others were too. There was the other way too. Those who had migrated from India to now Bangladesh, they had a similar kind of story. They belonged to the other community. And I had the opportunity of visiting my father-in-law's ancestral home in Bangladesh in the year 2009. It was on my father-in-law's insistence that he wanted to visit his home again, though he felt that he was visiting a foreign country. He needed a visa to go back to his own homeland. That was a different kind of an experience. And my husband had contacts there who had already contacted those people who were now living in that ancestral house. They were the loyal retainers, the servants that once served my father-in-law's family. And so we expected that we would get a grand welcome. But unfortunately, we were crestfallen to find that there was nobody out there. There was nobody to receive us. We entered into the house. People were out there, and there was this elderly lady who recognized my father-in-law. She was also a young woman at the time when my father-in-law left, one of the daughters of one of the servants out there. Uh, but something clicked, like, and the reception that they gave us, the hospitality, there was a sudden change. We didn't realize what it was. But then it was this elderly lady who explained that they felt that we had come back to reclaim that property. And they were very apprehensive. Okay? But on seeing us, their approach changed, and they knew that we had just come to give comfort to my father-in-law, who said that I've grown old and I would just like to set foot on that same house that I was born in. And well, it was an overwhelming situation. My father-in-law, he was so overwhelmed, he didn't talk for 2 days, and we had three generations standing there, setting foot on that ancestral property. My father in law, his son, my husband, and my son. Okay, there were three generations out there. And my father in law expressed the wish to carry back a little of the soil out there. And he told me that since you've taken all the pains of bringing me to my home again, when I go back to my eternal home, you should put that soil along with me so that I can carry it back home, because that is, after all, a home, but foreign in a foreign land. He couldn't get over the fact that he needed a visa, to a passport, to go back to his own home. Okay, so as I said, uh, the impact that these narratives had on me changed over the years. I think, Sourabhi, I've been able to answer what you have asked me. So if you want me to elaborate on something else, well,
Thank you, ma'am. Moving to my next question for Pramila. In your poem Against Erasure, you have talked about how memory can be unreliable. Memory is also said to be quite adaptive, but that also means an incomplete past. So, how much of this would you say is applicable when constructing refugee narratives, especially when it comes to women? And would you like to elaborate on this unreliability of memory and its connection to trauma and past with reference to your works? If you could read out some lines.
Thank you, Sourabhi. As I said earlier, memories keep shape shifting, and despite that, each shape has its own truth. Um, so one has to accept the unreliability of memory. But the thing is, it's important to express that memory in whatever way we can. In Sushmita's case, it was the storytelling that she heard as a child that stayed with her. And for me, it was again, hearing the stories of partition from my mother, that stayed with me. Um, and, then I was exploring, like, other kinds of uh, refugee narratives in India, but of course not consciously, because as a child, I was writing a lot of poems about my childhood, and I was writing about my childhood in Kerala because I spent my younger years in Cochin, and I grew up next to the synagogue, and I was sort of running in and out of the synagogue. We had there was a program that was happening. My parents were involved with the Jewish community because they were celebrating the 400th anniversary of the establishment of the Cochin synagogue, which is called the Paradesi synagogue. And I was a child, and so I grew up with all of these different cultures around me, and different symbols of these different religions, whether it was Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu. And so I think, as I was just writing these poems, it was only much later I was thinking about, oh, I'm writing these poems about the synagogue and the people there, etc. And I started inquiring into the history of how they arrived. And then I started digging deeper, did a lot of research and reading, looking at autoethnographies, and listening to Judeo-Malayalam songs, which are still sung in the service in the synagogue. And it was a whole world, a whole history that people don't really know about. And I felt like it was so important to capture that in poetry. So I wrote We Are Not a Museum. This is the book. It came out last year. And in this poem, I go deeper into the lives of the Jewish people when they traveled all the way from the areas of the Iraq and Palestine, into India. So there were two strands I discovered. One was actually one anthropologist dated to the third century AD. And then there's another strand that came into that area of Kerala after the 15th century, after the Spanish Inquisition. So these were like amazing, historical narratives. And so as I went deeper into it, I realized that here is a narrative of peaceful coexistence of refugees, finding a home where the Raja actually gives the land, a whole piece of land to people, and they settle there. And I was also intrigued about how one retains one's cultural identity in a different territory where the language, culture, dress, everything is different. And what I discovered was for the Jewish people, they retained their identity over the centuries through spirituality, retaining their spiritual customs, etc. So I felt that, this is a really important historical fact. It is not some kind of Pollyannish thinking that, oh, we can never have people living together, because historically it has happened where people did exist together, and it is possible. So only later, after I finished writing the book, I realized, oh my God, this is a book that really stands to speak against a kind of ethno nationalism and communalism. So it's a book that is a clear argument against nationalistic speeches. So I feel this book has a place in our discussion about refugees and about how one need not draw a border between people. So I'd like to read the poem. It's called Against Erasure, and the epigraph is by Nathan Katz, and it's in Hebrew, and I translate it as Next Year in Cochin. Years ago, I had left Cochin and I returned when its name changed to Kochi. Her Jewish people are a fine lacework as waves recede. If you find a jawbone in the new foundation, please return it to the rightful owner for reburial. Ich habe überall gesucht, yells a young woman cycling hard to keep up with her partner. Maybe they're looking for a restaurant, but the German grates against the refrain. Enni Tirtha Dinam, still sung celebrating British departure from Palestine in 1948. Someone says, we are lucky to have a minion. On my way to the service, a shopkeeper begs, you will look beautiful in this scarf, auntie. I bark, do I look like your auntie? I do the touristy thing. I buy a thumb length of lace for $200 because I believe it is the last of its kind made by two octogenarian Italian weavers. I imagine a bride wearing their artwork, serenaded by percussion and pipes. My bones are as creaky as these ferry boats. An elderly man complains, tired of repeating his story. I ask him why the Chinese tiles in the Paradesi synagogue show ships and ballooning sails, the pandemonium of commerce, willow and monasteries lining exotic shores. Those are holy too, he says. I recall, Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma. Everywhere is Brahman. We are racing against time, intone anthropologists, archiving every letter and coin, for memory is unreliable. My eyes hungrily scan fragments of the past mixed with the present. I know when the ferry drops me off on the opposite shore, words will evade my pen. Yeah, so you have the sense of time and how important it is to tell these stories before they are forgotten, before they are erased forever. So I want these stories to live on, just like Sushmita is telling her mother-in-law's story, because you don't want people to forget that. I'm telling my grandmother's story because I don't want her and her art and her the music that she created to be forgotten. It's so important to preserve these stories. And you, Sourabhi, have provided us a beautiful venue to actually showcase these stories and tell them to the world. So thank you.
Thank you, Pramila, for sharing that wonderful piece. Um, Coming back to Anjali, and since we are at it, memories. For women with memories of forced displacement, would you say that there is ever a journey back to safety which rebuilds that lost confidence? And how do your books, especially if I can name one, Southbound essays on identity, inheritance, and social change, inform the aftermath of this physical and emotional damage which push women towards anonymity?
Thank you for that question. And Pramila, thank you for another beautiful reading. I'm still thinking about your words. I think it's important at the outset to acknowledge that there is no one refugee story, there is no one partition story. There is a diversity of experiences on the journey towards some kind of healing, some kind of reestablishment in another place after displacement. And so I think it's important for those of us who are students of catastrophic eras in history to understand that we will have the opportunity through history textbooks, through archives, through social media to get really just a sliver of an understanding of what people experienced. And second, what we have to understand is that um, privilege played a role in whose stories got to be told, right? I mean, we all know that history is made by the people who are the most powerful, right? Who rise to the surface, so to speak. And so it's important to acknowledge that um, refugees, but specifically refugee women, were very much impacted in their journeys to healing based on their gender, based on their caste, based on their class, um, based on the kind of support that they received after they fled their homelands into their adoptive countries. So, we need to just make sure we honor all of those stories. When you read the archives, and I'm speaking about this as a researcher and a journalist, when you read the archives, it seems that what is the common thread through those who were able to rebuild some sort of a life after partition, it is those who were able to maintain some semblance of the communities that they fled with, their family members in particular, and those who were able to rebuild new communities with the support in their new countries. And that oftentimes again was a factor of class, caste, um, gender, ethnicity, religion, whether local governments were competent enough to even help refugees that had come into their areas to get back on their feet. So there's a lot of factors, and a lot of times the healing um, is not so much about an individual's resilience, but whether their communities and the systems that they are trying to live in and survive offer the kind of support that they need. When we think about archives, for example, folks who live through partition who speak a minority language, a language that is perhaps indigenous, one that is not well known, who was taking down their stories, right? Were their stories even told? How many people were taking down the stories of the protected castes? I think we have to ask those questions, because the opportunity to heal, sure, it is available to some people, but I think what's important is sort of extracting the institutional forces that might have led to some people being able to heal, and some people, not really being able to find that kind of healing.
Right. Thank you, Anjali. Moving on to Professor Das. The refugees, especially the women, of course, faced a lot of issues related to legal status, discrimination, access to healthcare, education, and social acceptance in the host country, if we could name a few. What were the biggest challenges faced by your family when they migrated to India during the Bengal partition? Also, do you think the refugee narratives in the East were any different from those of Pakistan and Punjab, given that the latter has been discussed much more?
I take Saurabhi's last question. Uh, uh, yeah, maybe the partition of Pakistan and Punjab, it has been talked about more, but I guess it is not really different, because all partition stories and narratives and challenges that the refugees face, I think, are very, very similar to each other, because they are interrelated and you cannot avoid. As I've already mentioned when I was telling the story of my mother-in-law's ordeal post partition, I think the common challenges were definitely the trauma, the psychological trauma, the financial crisis, social discrimination, isolation. But one thing that it's only the women, okay, they were subject to, of which most of the narratives have remained silent, excepting that they were spoken in house. Okay, the violation, the abuse, the exploitation that women as bodies, okay, that they were physically subject to. It happened on either side. Either they were forced to keep silent. But, like I've read a book called The Other Side of Silence, where the mother is narrating how her sons killed her daughters because she had been violated. Okay, and after much coaxing, she comes up with this story. Okay, it's a kind of a sense of guilt that had played in her mind. Yes, played in her mind. Because she felt that to save the honor, the prestige of her family, she needed to be silent about it. Okay, and it happened in the East also. We have many movies, we have many novels, we have many writings, we have many Bindu Bashinis, we have many Mallikas, we have authors like Manik Bandyopadhyay, we have authors like Pratibha Basu, who have dealt on this bit, that the women refugees, this was extra for them that they had to go through. And as Pramila was saying, that we wouldn't want to forget the stories, but I think there was a conscious effort to suppress this bit about the women refugees. And I think it's so dark that we would like to keep it within our hearts, discuss it in close quarters, not make it that much public. But the pain, I think it's palpable. Okay, and at the end of the day, I think what needs to be erased is that divide that that partition brought in. Maybe a religious divide, yes, definitely, for the partition of 1947 in India. What needs to be erased is also the blame game. Okay? That, yes, it's the other one who is to be blamed for what has happened. The other one says it's you for whom what has happened. After all, I think it's the whimsical Radcliffe line that is responsible for all the crisis that people went through, be it our family members or the rest that migrated from Pakistan to India, from India to Pakistan, from East Pakistan to Bengal, and from Bengal to East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. So I think happy memories should be there. We have to make the stories of struggle, we have to take it in the positive stride, take it as an inspiration to move forward. But that is not to say that the women did not have to face challenges which men did not, because it was the men, like amongst the refugees to the men, they took advantage. They took advantage of women, their frail natures, and their bodies. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Moving to Pramila, you have written a lot on Jewish history. You shared that beautiful excerpt earlier. So, and your collection is called "We Are Not a Museum." But Jews, be it in the World War context or some other, have always remained just that, a museum. Without taking any names, a recent Bollywood film did the same, where the creators had tried to build a connection between the Holocaust killings to, and everything that had happened to marital problems. Amidst all this, what has been your own relationship with the Jewish history, and how would you say that they have tried, that you have tried to be authentic in your representation so that they don't become mere aesthetic symbols of resilience and hardships, but instead a reminder of how powerful stories still remain to be a vital strategy for reclamation?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I'm very conscious that when I'm writing about a culture, that I'm not merely appropriating or using it as you point out, for aesthetic reasons. So as I became more conscious about my childhood connection, so it was more of an emotional connection that I felt with Jewish people, mainly because of my early childhood experience. But only as I started writing more about it, about my childhood, that I started thinking more about Jewish history. And for that, I did extensive research. So these poems are not a facile or superficial engagement with the material, but it came out of very conscious reading and engagement with various kinds of research materials that resulted in these poems. So generally, when we think of poetry, we don't really connect it with analysis. But I strongly believe that some of the strongest analysis actually occurs in poetry. So what I wanted to do was a kind of a witness writing, at the same time bring in the emotional existence of several generations of people. um, and I do accept that I can only go so far, because I am not part of that community. So I totally accept that I can only go this far. For a person to write really, really in depth, one has to be part of that community. But there has to be an interest in reaching into other communities and not stay within one's own bubble. And that's something I've become more conscious of living in the United States, and looking at some of the racism that happens around me, and at the same time being part of communities that are really trying their best to figure out how to get everybody to talk to each other and, be more accepting of each other. So I think I forgot the second part of the question that you asked, but what I would say is that um, it's important to enter in emotionally into the lives of other people, and for us to do that is to listen very carefully to other people when they're speaking, and to really try to practice compassion. And this, so when we think about refugee stories, we think about these very, very large ideas, but I think it has to start from the very individual experience and interaction with others. So it has to start with compassion within one's family, practicing it within one's friend circle, within the community that you're working with. Even if you're leading a particular organization, how do you lead compassionately so that others do not feel any kind of exclusion? So I think one has to be aware of all these different layers. So which means that one has to open oneself up emotionally and psychologically, mentally, whatever, to seeing other people and where they're coming from.
Right. Thank you, Pramila. Um, moving to my last question, if since we have been talking about literature too in this session, if I can name two most global literary figures, one is Ismat Chugtai and Rabindranath Tagore. Ismat Chugtai is celebrated both in India and Pakistan equally, while Rabindranath Tagore's composition is the national anthem in both India and Bangladesh. Many historians have taken up partition memorabilia in their research as well, and the refugee women, perhaps played a great role in certain cross-culture exchanges where the lines of partition could not restrict the weaves of fabric, the food recipes, the jewelry designs, and the language from sweeping across the countries and influencing the choices. So inviting your individual thoughts on this matter. Anjali, would you like to go first?
Thank you. And I will keep this very brief. I think refugee women have always been the keepers of the family stories. They're the keepers of the ancestral stories. They are the ones who keep the family recipes, who keep the family heirlooms, and who listen to the stories of their ancestors so they can retell their stories for their children. And so, what I would say again is give a shout out to archives and encourage everyone to support archives. The 1947 partition archive, in particular, has done an outstanding job, and these stories are available on their social media websites for you to read. They also have a recent book out. And I will give another shout out to this book cover. It's by my dear friend Madhushi Ghosh. The subtitle is An Immigrant Journey of Food, Memory, and Family. And this answers your final question. This is a story about a Bengali family who had to escape what was then East Pakistan and resettle in India, and a daughter who now lives in California, who, after her parents passed, tried to put together the history of her family in East Pakistan and the cultures and the traditions she grew up with her family, who had to now bring those cultures and traditions in a new home in India. And it's a fabulous book. And I think the key to the answer of this question is to locate and research and read the survivor stories of the women, because they are the ones who are often holding the cultural history in their hands and their hearts.
Thank you, Anjali. Moving on to Professor Das.
Yes, Sourabhi, you mentioned Rabindranath Tagore. I think where Bangladesh and India is concerned, it's the language, Bangla, which has erased the political divide between Bangladesh and India. And of course, there has been exchange of cultures, and here in India we do love to have, not just India, Bengal also, we love to have bhuna chicken and biryani that is cooked in Bangladesh, and vice versa, they love to have our food. The host inhabitants too, they love shutki mach, I think dried fish, that is, which is a specialty of Bangladesh. And we also love to have food of the host country here, which is cooked in a different manner. And of course, we both the countries, the women of both the countries love to wear Dhakai Jamdani, and we too have our own Bengal Jamdani saris. So I think it answers your question, Saurabhi. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you, Professor Das. Pramila?
Yeah, I totally agree with Anjali and Sushmita that food really brings people together. Absolutely. And I think what also people brings all the different parts of India, Pakistan, all these different borders together is rice. We all love rice. So just putting it out there, rice and fish. Um, and my concluding statement is that wherever one sees, great political discord, it's really important to speak up. It's one can easily get complicit in our silence when things are going the wrong way, and we know what is right, what is wrong. So I don't think we should all put our heads in the sand and say, oh, everything is hunky-dory. I think it's important to speak up, and in whatever way one can, whether it is through writing, to talking to friends about what is going wrong, talking to family members even though they may not agree with you. But I think it's important to put your speech out there in whatever way one can. And if you're in a position where you can actually act, you can make your action show by electing the leaders who you think will really help with not creating borders but bringing people together.
Thank you, Pramila, for that wonderful concluding statement. So that brings us to the end of today's session. Thank you once again, Professor Das, Anjali, and Pramila, for this very insightful conversation, and of course, for your time this evening. Please allow me to remind you that Tell Me a Story is calling for submissions on the story prompt, that is Women Without Names. Registrations are also open for the writing program season 13. We hope to hear from you soon. Till then, stay well, stay happy. Good night.